Hi, everybody. It's great to have you with us tonight. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to our 62nd consecutive Town Hall series. Our leadership team includes Mel Levine, David Lehrer, Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. You saw our list of co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago, and we are grateful to all of them. Thank you so much for your support. I want to encourage you to make a donation to help small via the link in the chat during the program or via the email you receive right after the program. Now, my colleague and friend, David Lehrer, will give you some very brief highlights of upcoming programs. David?
Thank you, Janice. It's great to be here once again for America at a Crossroads virtual town hall. Our topic tonight is a fascinating one, and the panel is unique. Our moderator and our two guests could each by themselves hold forth for the entire hour on what the second impeachment trial and all its drama and evidence mean. We're especially fortunate to have such a distinguished and erudite panel. They'll be introduced in a minute. I wanted to let you know of two exciting upcoming programs, one of which came together this week with two Pulitzer Prize winners. On July 21, we will host New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, who is joining us again along with his colleague David Leonhardt, founder of the Upshot column and longtime business and economic writer and editor for the paper. They'll explore the long-term implications of the COVID year on our economy, on our politics, and on our lives. Next week, we host the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served from 2007 to 2011, who is now a visiting professor at Princeton, Mike Mullen. His storied career prepared him to discuss America in Decline with KCRW's Warren Albee. It's now my pleasure to introduce a decades-long friend, a member of the JUDJ Executive Committee, and an indispensable member of the America at a Crossroads team, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel?
Thank you very much, David. It's a wonderful privilege to work with you guys on all of these weekly programs. And tonight, we've got, as you've both mentioned, a superb program with three fabulous speakers. Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is not here quite yet, but I am confident will be here very, very shortly, is a third-term representative from Maryland's 8th Congressional District, which stretches from just outside Washington, D.C. to the Pennsylvania border. Prior to that, he served 3 terms in the Maryland State Senate, and he's been a professor of con law at American University's Washington College of Law for more than 25 years. I'm going to skip his numerous congressional committees and accomplishments and just provide my own succinct summary view. At this time, with American democracy literally on the line, it's imperative for us to have highly capable, honest, and effective members of Congress. You need to look no further than how Congressman Raskin is viewed by his colleagues and also to the prosecution of the second impeachment of Donald Trump to know that Jamie Raskin exemplifies those qualities. America is fortunate to have Jamie in Congress at this time, and we are fortunate to have him with us tonight. And I also want to wish him, on behalf of all of us, our condolences for the unbearable loss that he and his family are enduring. Our second speaker, someone we're also very, very pleased to have and who's a repeat performer for us, is Professor Rick Hasen, who is perhaps America's preeminent expert on election law, voter suppression, and campaign finance regulation. He's the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Irvine. He's a prolific writer, having been published in virtually every prominent publication in America. He is an essential voice at a time where the underpinnings of our democracy are threatened by a major political party whose arguments are based upon a litany of outright lies. Rick's most recent op-ed in the July 1st New York Times spells out succinctly and powerfully the dangers to America in the most recent US Supreme Court opinions, particularly in the area of voter suppression. I am especially pleased also to introduce Jane Mayer, who is a superstar reporter and chief Washington correspondent for the New Yorker magazine, where she has spent the last 26 years of an extraordinary career. Her penetrating analyses and insights regarding the role of money in politics have made her an indispensable voice in exposing some of the most powerful people and methods corrupting American politics today. Her numerous path-breaking stories and seminal books include her critically acclaimed book, Dark Money, which should be required reading for anybody interested in our political system. I must admit to an added personal pleasure in introducing Jane in light of her longtime friendship with her New Yorker colleague, Connie Bruck, to whom I happen to be married. With that, Jane, I turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. It is true that Mel Levine is famous as a congressman, but even more so at the New Yorker for being married to Connie Bruck, who's talk about a superstar reporter. Thanks. It's so great to be with both of the guests here tonight. I'm honored to be in your company, both of you. I guess I will start by posing a question to the congressman. Congressman Raskin, first of all, I think I speak for everyone, thanking you so much for your incredible performance as the impeachment manager during what must have been just an unthinkably difficult time. Both of you are public intellectuals and tremendous public servants, and so I just got to thank you. But now I just want to ask you also, so what do you think that the second impeachment really accomplished, given that part of it was about to try to hold Trump accountable for his false claims that he had won the election, which he seems to have just doubled down on since then. So what did it achieve, and what are you hoping that the select committee can achieve that it didn't?
Well, first of all, Jane, thank you for your kind words and for your extraordinary journalism, which is essential to defending democracy in these dark days. And thank you, Congressman Levine, for your very thoughtful words. And that means a lot to me. I'm delighted to be there with everybody. And thank you all for staying profoundly engaged in the struggle of our lives here. So, Jane, it is true that Donald Trump beat the constitutional spread. We needed 67 votes to convict him and disqualify him from ever holding federal office again. We got 57 votes. So I guess from one perspective, you could say that was a loss, although I resist the announcement that he was acquitted. I don't think he was acquitted. I think we had a hung jury in a way. We certainly had a commanding majority of both the House and the Senate on bipartisan terms, finding him guilty of having incited a violent insurrection against the Congress, against the government. And so I believe that the presentations of the two sides were so lopsided. There was such a vast gulf between the extraordinary mobilization of facts and evidence that we had on our side and nothing on their side other than a couple of propaganda reels showing that people use the phrase fight like hell as political rhetoric, but only certain people use it as political rhetoric in the course of inciting a violent insurrection against their own government. But I think that there was such a mismatch there, as some of the commentators said, that we convicted Donald Trump in the eyes of the American public, and we certainly convicted him in the eyes of history, and I think we convicted him in the eyes of the world. I believe that he is an untouchable political pariah in the mainstream of American politics and the full range of American politics. But at the same time, he has only tightened his stranglehold over the Republican Party, which today much less resembles a modern political party and much more resembles something like a religious cult of personality, where everything that he says goes, and he dictates the meaning of the truth to people. So if the election was stolen and he tells you that, then you believe that. If he turned around tomorrow and said, oh, it was all a big mistake, it wasn't stolen, then they would say, oh, it wasn't stolen, you know. So there's been a destruction of critical thinking skills in large parts of the public. But the vast majority of the American people reject Trump, reject Trumpism. We're not a racist society. We're not an anti-Semitic society. We're not a misogynistic society. We're not a sexist society. But we are governed by antiquated and obsolete political rules and institutions. And the Republicans now control every anti-democratic lever of power, from, you know, the hundreds of pieces of voter suppression, voter restriction legislation they're trying to pass all over the country, to the gerrymandering of our congressional districts, to right-wing judicial activism by the packing of the courts, to the filibuster, and to the Electoral College, which has been a reactionary institution for as long as we've had America. So we need a dramatic renovation and reform of our political institutions if we're going to allow the majority to govern. So that's really the issue. Are we going to have Democratic majority rule or not? Are we going to continue to be ruled by a small and shrinking right-wing minority that controls these levers of power?
Well, this gets me to Professor Hasen, who has been looking a lot at the backlash that Trump has spawned in terms of voting rights and election law. Rick, you've been talking about how the peril is not just the voter suppression issue, but even beyond that, election subversion. What are you seeing out there, and how worried should we be about that?
Well, first, it's great to be with you all, and honored to be with my old friend, Jamie Raskin, and been so proud of what he's accomplished over the last few years. There is a distinction, I think, between election subversion and voter suppression. And it's an important one, and it's one I think we need to focus on, especially because of the apparent failure of Democrats to push through H.R. 1, the big voting rights and election bill. So voter suppression, we all know what that is. It's when Georgia passes a law that says it's a crime to give someone a glass of water if they're waiting on a long line on a hot day to vote. But election subversion is about something else. It's not about making it harder for people to register or vote. It's about manipulating how votes are counted and how election processes are conducted to assure that the winner of the election is what actually reflects the will of the people. And I'm not talking here about the Electoral College and how that distorts things, and California having the same representation in the Senate. I mean, these are all structural issues. I'm talking about something much more basic, which is the winner going to be the person who got more votes in an election? And one of the things that Donald Trump did was he tried in numerous states to get the election results changed, right? So he called Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, and asked him to find 11,780 votes to give him a one-vote victory over Joe Biden. He contacted Maricopa County's election officials to try to get them to stop the counting. He contacted Michigan and Wisconsin Republican legislators to try to get them to overturn the vote and have the legislature appoint a second slate of electors, which would have created even more problems when Congress counted the Electoral College votes on January 6th. And so I think the most urgent priority for Congress right now is not to pass a law that stops voter suppression, as near and dear as that is. I've written 2 books on this. It's something I care about a lot, but this is a much more urgent problem and has the potential to gain some bipartisan support the way that some Republicans did come on the side of impeachment. If you're trying to pass laws that say, for example, every state has to have a paper ballot for federal elections so we can do a recount and make sure that the winner who was declared is actually the winner, maybe if there's anything in the election world that could get some Republicans to sign on, it should be something that assures that the winner declared is actually the winner.
Congressman, do you think that you could succeed in passing some kind of legislation with bipartisan support that would address this sort of voter suppression, the election subversion issues, and do you think what do you think the related to that the likelihood is that HR1 could in some fashion still get passed? Do you see, what do you think the future of that is?
Well, it all depends on the filibuster. And so it depends on the willingness of Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema to confront the filibuster and to at least carve out a democracy exception for the filibuster, the way there was an exception carved out for judicial nominations, which is what enabled McConnell and the gang to put, hundreds of unqualified Federalist Society right-wing bloggers on the federal courts, but you know more about that than I do, Jane. So that's one question, but Rick is absolutely correct to direct our attention to these election subversion maneuvers. In other words, first try to suppress the vote, and if that doesn't work, then you put the right personnel in place. And they're doing that, some with statutory restructuring and some with just running people. Like my colleague, Jody Heiss from Georgia, is leaving the US House of Representatives to run for Secretary of State against Brad Raffensperger because he already proved himself insufficiently loyal and sycophantic to Donald Trump. And they want to make sure the next time this happens, which could be as early as 2024, or 2022 for all we know, that they've got the right personnel in place. So the lesson that the mainstream GOP establishment is taken from everything that just happened is there are some people who are not following orders strictly enough. Let's get rid of those people. So I don't think that election subversion legislation would be treated any differently by Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy than our efforts in HR1 to deal with voter suppression. I mean, from their perspective, it's just, does this help Republicans or does this hurt Republicans? And so to the extent that we remove the means for them to manipulate elections in order to thwart majority rule and to guarantee a minority outcome, then we're getting in their way. So, I'm totally with Rick, and we should definitely caucus about the legislation that we need to deal with these problems, but I don't think there's any chance that the people who run the Republican Party are going to view them any differently than the bills that we've got to try to stop them from putting people in jail for passing somebody a bottle of water or a Snickers bar while they're waiting 5 hours to vote.
Well, I've got a question for both of you, the same question for both of you, because we've talked about Trump as basically a cult-like figure and the leader of this sort of voter suppression and election subversion movement. But is this really a Trump issue alone, or does it require? Do you have hope that after Trump this will die down, or is this something that is really changed the nature of the Republican Party and is something we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future? Is it moving in an anti-democratic direction on its own, or does it take Trump?
Are you asking me, Jane?
Sure.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear what Rick's got to say, but I absolutely think that Trumpism will survive Trump and out-Trump Trump. At this point, the people running for Congress, for US Senate, are all trying to out-Trumpify their opponents. And if you think about it in macro historical terms, you're talking about a political party which has now decided to be the voice of white male resentment and anger about the changes taking place in the country. And rather than trying to figure out how to reach out to women and young people and African Americans and Hispanics and new immigrants, they've just decided to be the voice of outrage and resentment. And that's a serious problem for us to deal with as a country. How do you make people feel okay about the changes that have come to the country? And how do we keep them from exploiting the failures of their own policies to scapegoat and blame people who don't look like them or pray like them or live like them.
And Rick, what do you think? Is this a Trump phenomenon or something deeper?
I think that's a really tough question to answer. Certainly, I would agree that Donald Trump unlocked something in the Republican Party. I mean, you think about, do you remember when Jeb Bush was running and he had this $87 million super PAC behind him and he was getting under 1%? He was not exciting anyone. And Trump was able to put together kind of a combination of xenophobia, anti-immigration, pro-religion, going after white rage. And, there's a joke that it's not economic anxiety, it's actually racism. And I think what he was able to accomplish was to realign both political parties. So there are lots of people I know who were Republicans who believed in lower taxes and free trade and now don't feel like they have a home in the Republican Party. And so we're getting this realignment. And there are many, lower income white voters and also some Latino voters that we've seen attracted to the Trumpian message. And so we're in the midst of this realignment. And the question about whether Trumpism survives is whether or not someone else can have the charisma to keep the coalition together. It's not clear if that will work. I mean, I think Trump is unique in that way. Could Ron DeSantis attract crowds like Trump? Could he get out the vote and excite people in the same way? One of the problems that Republicans had in Georgia in the runoff elections when Democrats won both Senate seats was that Trump wasn't on the ballot. So I don't think we know. I certainly think Trumpism will survive, but we've got this weird system where basically because of how we conduct our elections in most of the country, where it's a first past the post system, whoever gets the most votes wins. Really, if you don't like the Republican Party, your only viable alternative under a system where whoever gets the most votes wins is vote for Democrats. And there are some people that won't vote for Democrats because they don't like what they stand for on any number of issues. And so unless we move to things like ranked choice voting or some kind of majority runoff or something, I think that Trumpists will succeed. And so that, if I was coming together with a wish list of things that I would want to do, aside from going after election subversion, it would be to change the primary system so that we can elect more moderate Republicans. It's not going to be liberal Democrats that are going to save the country. It's going to have to be responsible Republicans, and there are fewer and fewer of them. And so let me just push back a little bit on Jamie's point about, why would Republicans support election subversion legislation? I think that Mitch McConnell does not want a repeat of what he saw on January 6th. And in terms of not just the insurrection, but in terms of so many Republicans voting to object to the electoral returns, I think he would have an interest in rewriting the Electoral Count Act, which is this old 1887 Byzantine, horribly written law that governs how electoral college votes are counted. He would have an interest in fixing that in a technical fix. If it could be done quietly, not as a part of a big voting rights bill, I think some of these things could actually get done. And I worry with Rob Portman and Roy Blunt leaving the Senate, those are two fewer adults in the room, if this drags out after 2022. And who knows if Republicans take one or both houses of Congress, what might be possible at all. I'm guessing we'll see total stalemate.
Congressman, to get back to one of the questions that I was asking at the beginning, and it's related to this, what do you think you can accomplish with the Select Committee investigation? What are the questions you still have? And how do you get past this hardened partisan divide to reach the people who seem to be so inured against listening to the facts here? Can you do it with the Select Committee? Do you think
Yes.
Was Liz Cheney help in some way?
Yes, we absolutely can do it, Jane, with the Select Committee. To begin with, remember, this was the most bipartisan presidential impeachment and trial conviction process in American history. We've only had 4 trials. We had Andrew Johnson, we had Bill Clinton, we had Trump 1, and we had Trump 2. And this is by far the most bipartisan, where we had 10 House Republicans join us in impeaching the president for inciting a violent insurrection. And then 7 Republicans from all over the country, New England, Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, the South, the West, Alaska, join us in saying that we had clearly sustained our burden of proving that Donald Trump had incited this violent insurrection against the 2020 election in order to stay in power. So we have a block of Republicans. I mean, they're somewhere around 6 or 7% of the Republican Party. If 6 or 7% of the Republicans left the party, they could never recover from that. It would lead to a complete collapse of their party. I mean, they're already a distinct minority, and as I was saying, just thrive on these anti-democratic mechanisms that are built like booby traps into our democratic process. But I think that in the trial, our focus was on one guy, and it was on one crime. It was on Donald Trump for mere incitement to violent insurrection, which was perfectly obvious to anybody who was listening to him and watching him that he was doing that. We did not go after who organized the insurrection, who paid for the insurrection, how did they do it, why did they do it, and are they still out there? Is this still going on right now? So our charge from the legislation creating the Select Committee is to develop a complete and authoritative analysis of the events of January 6th and the causes that gave rise to it. And we are already bipartisan, and Kevin McCarthy has not appointed his people yet. Obviously, we're hoping, against hope perhaps, that he doesn't just appoint circus performers whose sole goal is going to be to try to distract and undermine the legislative mission. I mean, there are certainly some people who know how to turn everything into a partisan food fight. But right now with Liz Cheney, who you will recall was the chair of the House Republican Conference up till just several months ago, we have a meaningful bipartisan group that wants to get to the bottom of this terrorist attack on America and on our election process.
And do you think you have any idea whether you'll be able to really ferret out what Trump's role was and his relationship was to January 6th? And
well, we're going to follow the facts wherever they go. We have subpoena power to use. We know with Liz Cheney, we've got a working bipartisan majority that wants to get to the truth and not censor it or, to coin a phrase, cancel it in the interest of advancing one political party's agenda. We're not going to indulge any of that, because really our democracy is on the line. And I know people feel it, because wherever I go, people come up to me and they say, you've got to stop them and you've got to save American democracy. We got too much wrapped up in this. And, people understand that democracy is very much the exception in terms of the history of our species. I mean, most people have been governed by dictators and despots and tyrants and bullies. And those are all of Donald Trump's friends, all the people who are rooting for America's failure today: Putin in Russia and Orban in Hungary and Duterte in the Philippines and El-Sisi in Egypt. All of the tyrants and despots and kleptocrats have gotten together, and they would love nothing more than the resurrection of the Trumpocracy. For one thing, they believe that we would at that point never get rid of him again. And after what we saw on January 6th, it's quite possible we would never be able to get rid of him or the people who take power. They had plans for calling a state of emergency, imposing martial law, which was what Michael Flynn was asking for. And Michael Flynn has actually continued to articulate his support for martial law, invoking what happened in Burma as an example for what could happen in America.
Unbelievable. Well, Rick, where is the Supreme Court in all of this? Are you expecting help or hindrance from them on these democracy issues? And what can you derive from the Brnovich decision in terms of their priorities on this subject?
Well, I've got to say, I fell out of love with the Supreme Court a long time ago. And, they still have this vague, dim halo from the Warren Court years in Brown versus Board and Roe versus Wade. But that stuff is long gone. I mean, the Supreme Court has retreated to its basic reactionary baseline. It has been a profoundly conservative or reactionary institution for the vast majority of American history. And we're back there. And we did see that in that recent election decision. I mean, I think that the conservative ruling bloc on the court is not going to depart meaningfully from a GOP agenda. It's true they didn't pick up the baton from Donald Trump's ridiculous lawsuit that he ginned up from the Attorney General of Texas at the end there, which was based literally on nothing. I mean, it was the most fraudulent thing in the world, which of course was the empty theory they wanted to advance in the joint session of Congress on January 6th, after it had been rejected by 61 or 62 courts in different variations and different permutations. But there was no fraud, there was no corruption, and everybody knows that. And their constitutional claim is utterly frivolous. But I would say, in terms of any of the voting questions we're talking about, election subversion, voting suppression, and so on, this is a court that is going to walk a very hard right line. And so the courts are not going to save us. Our big hope here is that we can galvanize and mobilize the American people to be engaged all over the country, in every state, in every community. And I spoke to a bunch of college kids this last week, and they said they were really despondent about what they were seeing and what was going on. What could they do? And I said, I'll give you the same advice I give to the little kids in soccer. Don't bunch. Not everybody has to live in DuPont Circle or in Brooklyn. Go out to North Carolina and move to Alaska, get your 20 best friends and go to Montana. Don't forget that Vermont used to be a very conservative state, and then Bernie Sanders and a bunch of hippies began to move there in the 1960s and 70s, and look at it today. So people need to spread out.
Professor Hasen, what do you think in the brnovich case? Do you think that it augurs in terms of what will happen when future challenges keep coming at them about election law and voting rights? And particularly on these elections subversion issues, do you see them as likely to lay down the law about? I mean, what I'm seeing is some of the state legislators are trying to change the rules about how electors are chosen, and put the legislature in charge of being able to override the popular vote on it. And where do you see? Do you think the court's going to come down and save us, or is Jamie right that we can't count on this court to save us?
So let me first give one cheer to the Supreme Court and to all of the lower courts that rejected attempts to try to steal the election. Okay, I admit it's a low bar. That complaint, I think I was quoted as calling it dangerous garbage, the Texas complaint. We now know that Chris Kobach, the former Secretary of State of Kansas, was behind the effort to get the Department of Justice to try to file the same complaint originally in the Supreme Court. The court didn't bite. It was virtually unanimous in not even wanting to hear the case. There were two justices that have a kind of a technical view that you have to take any case that's filed by one state against another, but there was no indication that they were going to take this legally frivolous and factually frivolous lawsuit. Okay, there's the one cheer, but everything else is a big hiss. First of all, you had 4 justices on the Supreme Court, and this is before Amy Coney Barrett, the newest Supreme Court justice, was fully in place. 4 justices, Gorsuch, Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh, who expressed support, at least in theory, for this view that state courts do not have the power to construe election rules that deviate in any way from what the state legislature has said the rule should be, even if the state legislature violates the state's own constitution. It's kind of a weird technical theory, but it's a theory on which the entire election could have turned if the whole election came down to Pennsylvania and votes that came in the last 3 days after voting when the state Supreme Court had extended the election. So do I think they would have thrown the election to Trump if it turned on those Pennsylvania votes? Absolutely, I do. Because there would be a credible legal theory to hang their hat on. And let me remind you, we're all kind of veterans of Bush versus Gore, the 2000 case, where the Supreme Court told the country that state legislatures have the power anytime to take back their power to appoint electors directly. That is, the state of Georgia could pass a law tomorrow that says, we're not holding an election for president anymore. We're going to pick the electors ourselves. I think that's totally constitutional. Now, you could try and make an argument that, somehow the 14th Amendment would block that because the 14th Amendment came after Article 2. I mean, you can make arguments, but I don't think they would fly with this court. And so election subversion, if it happens in a constitutional way, in a way that the conservatives on the Supreme Court would see as legitimate, absolutely it could happen. If it's, Rudy Giuliani getting up there, dripping his hair dye and making ridiculous claims about what is the latest one? Satellites from Italy changing the ballots, Italygate. That's not going to fly with these. These are serious people on the court, but they are ideologues, as are the justices on the left on the Supreme Court. They're all ideologues. That's why they're chosen for the court. And they're going to break down, in the cases that really matter, they're going to break down 6-3. Maybe not in a bankruptcy case or an ERISA case or something that nobody really cares about. But when it comes to race and voting, that's John Roberts' bread and butter. That's Sam Alito. They were both working on these issues in the 1980s. I just recorded a podcast this afternoon about Brnovich, and it forced me to write a second op-ed, which I hope will appear at Slate later today. I'm so angry at this opinion because it turns the Voting Rights Act on its head and rolls the clock back to 1982, when registration was hard and early voting was scarce. This is an opinion not where Justice Alito applied the law. This is an opinion where Justice Alito gave states an excuse to pass whatever restrictive legislation they want that makes it harder for minority voters to vote and defend themselves in court against a voting right challenge. And part of it is actually piggybacking on Trump's big lie. And this is maybe the worst part of the opinion. It's not something I focused on in my New York Times op-ed from last week that I know was circulated. Justice Alito talks time and again about the need to prevent voter fraud and how voter fraud undermines voter confidence, and that the state doesn't have to prove that voter fraud is actually a problem. It can just state it. And this is the opposite of what the court said in another case it decided in the last day, a case called Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta. In that case, the state has to come forward with lots and lots of evidence that its campaign disclosure laws are necessary. It has to satisfy exacting scrutiny. And the plaintiffs in that case, they don't need to show that they're actually chilled by the rules. They just can state it, right? It's the flip side of what we see in the Brnovich case. In Brnovich, plaintiffs have all the burdens, the state has no burden. In Americans for Prosperity, the state has all the burden and plaintiffs have no burden. What explains that besides ideology? Absolutely nothing. Nothing in the text of the Constitution, in its history, in precedent. It's in fact subverting precedent in both cases.
So do you think, Congressman Raskin, do you think that there's any chance that the size of the court will be changed? It would take, I suppose, lifting the filibuster rules and also a progressive surge, but in the House. But what do you think the future of the filibuster is, and what do you think the possibility is that there will be some kind of structural change on the Supreme Court? I know it's being studied by the White House, and I'm assuming that commission is not going to come up with radical recommendations. But what do you think the chances are that anything can be done to change the makeup, size of the court, and the filibuster rules?
Jane, forgive me. Let me just say one word on what Rick was just talking about there, because the Electoral College has proven itself to be a terrible danger to the American people. For one thing, it has repeatedly given us popular vote losers as president, including George W. Bush in 2000, including Donald Trump in 2016. It has marginalized and sidelined the vast majority of the American people in the general election process, because it all comes down immediately to 8 or 9 states, which means 80% of the states have people who are just watching because we live in safe blue states or safe red states. So it's a completely arbitrary and irrational way to shape the process. But I think what we've just learned from the 2020 election is it's also dangerous because it creates all of these choke points for intervention by pernicious strategic actors. And again, the political scientists tell us that the surest sign of a successful coup is a recently failed coup. And so the people who tried to conduct the violent insurrection against us were taking notes about what worked and what didn't work. And obviously, Mike Pence was the major roadblock to them on January 6th. If they had a pliant number two to Donald Trump at that point, their plan almost certainly would have worked, or it would have thrown the country into real chaos and mayhem. So the very first bill I introduced as a state senator, Jane, in Maryland, was the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Maryland initiated this interstate agreement to get states to join, and it's activated when we have 270 electors part of it. But what it says is that we'll cast our electors, all of the states in the coalition, not for the winner in our state, but for the winner of the national popular vote. And that will be the bridge to get us out of this nightmare. And most constitutional amendments that favor the right to vote started with state action first, whether you're talking about women's suffrage or enfranchising African Americans or what have you. But back on your point, you know, of course, it's possible theoretically to change the composition of the Supreme Court. I think it's happened 9 or 10 different times in US history. There's nothing in the Constitution about 9, as much as the Republicans would like to make you believe that. But I've not thrown, you know, a lot of political stock into this, just because it would be so difficult. Well, even to get all the Democrats aboard, because there's so much confusion about it, you would get solid ironclad Republican opposition, which means you'd have to deal with the filibuster. But I think we're a lot more likely to be able to put the votes together to deal with the filibuster on voting rights and popular majority rule in America than we are, you know, tampering with the current size of the court. And again, I'm not opposed to it if I thought it's something that could be done. You know, one of my constituents is Merrick Garland, who was completely run roughshod over when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. And you'll recall Mitch McConnell said there's no way that the Senate would ever vote on a Supreme Court nomination in the last year of a president's term in office. And of course, you will recall him stuffing Amy Coney Barrett through in the last 7 or 8 weeks of the presidential term under Trump, and they laughed about it. I mean, for them, it is a big joke. You know, this is what the right wing is about. They don't know how to deliver shots in arms or move the economy or help the states and counties and localities, but they know how to hang on to power. And they are deadly serious about that. That's what we're up against right now.
I'm now, as your moderator, supposed to move to the point where we take questions from the audience. And I've got one here from a constituent of Jamie Raskin's who says, Congressman Raskin, he would like to know, would you consider running for Senator Cardin's seat when he retires in 2024?
Well, it's sweet of you to ask. I suppose I would consider anything. I don't know. I've been writing a book about our son, Tommy, and about what happened on January 6th and about the trial and what it all means for America. And I've got to finish up my book this summer, and then I'll think about the future. But I will tell you that one senator came over to me in the middle of the trial and said, nothing, if you ever got elected to the US Senate, there's nothing that you could do here that would ever be as important as what you did here this week.
A Republican said that to you? A Republican?
I'll just leave it at a senator said that to me.
Okay. I mean, I did want to ask one question, which was, since you are up there on the Hill, you know, and I don't know how often you know, Republicans confide in you, but do you have any sense, has anyone who's on the Republican side expressed any kind of, you know, private concern about Trump? And do you have any sense that they'd like to break the fever and might be able to? Or
well, obviously the ones who voted to convict him.
Yeah.
You know, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, of all places, told me it was his proudest vote that he ever cast, and he was being reprimanded, castigated, censured. He was the full-blown victim of right-wing cancel culture, just like Senator Burr was in North Carolina. But he said that it was his proudest vote. So there are people who've taken a strong stand on it. I mean, Liz Cheney has become, you know, a very dynamic constitutional patriot right now. But I will tell you that there were others who even voted for him who regretted it. And I think that Mitch McConnell's in that category. You'll recall the speech that he made after after the 57-43 vote, where he got up and he said, Donald Trump is singularly, morally, and practically responsible for the attack on the Congress. And he just lambasted him. And he said, that the impeachment managers had made their case and so on. But he went back to hanging his hat on the thin constitutional claim, which had been rejected on the first day of the trial, which was the assertion that the Senate could not try a former president. We think we demonstrated that more than 2 centuries of American history refuted that. I mean, there were trials of former officials in the first Congress. This was thoroughly ventilated and debated in the Belknap decision after the Civil War. And it cuts against the plain language of the Constitution, because the Constitution gives the House of Representatives the sole power to impeach. We impeached Donald Trump while he was president for acts that he conducted while he was president. And then the Constitution says that the Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. Well, that was an impeachment. And I think most people got that. And so I think what was really going on with Mitch McConnell was that he could not get enough senators either to convict, I would like to think, or maybe he couldn't get enough senators, a majority, to guarantee his continued tenure in office as the majority leader or the minority leader. He probably wanted to see that a majority of the Republicans were with him. But we think that he was ready to convict, but there weren't enough Republicans who wanted to go along. And that's a pretty sad statement, because when the Republicans would come to see me in our little war room in 2019, I would say, you got to do this for America, you got to do it for the Constitution, but you also got to do it for the Republican Party, because he will destroy your party. And I believe that he will. I think that Abraham Lincoln will be their first president and Donald Trump will be their last. And we'll get a different party that emerges from it.
I have to say, I've been out in Arizona, and the hardcore that's backing Trump is just as radical as ever, but they are alienating the center voters, the independent voters that a Republican candidate, just like a Democratic candidate, needs to win. So they're backing themselves into a corner there, which is interesting. I don't know, a bit. They seem unable to sort of break with it, nonetheless. So let's see. Somebody named Tom asks, given the election suppression and voter restriction laws, what are the keys to Democrats holding on to the House in 2022? I think that's a politics question, probably for Jamie Raskin again.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you've got it right. I'm not so worried about the midterm election effect, that presidents tend to lose in the off year, because I think that Biden and Harris are just doing a splendid, remarkable job. The real issue is the gerrymandering of the congressional districts. I mean, the Republicans are basically in firm control in Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia. That's 96 US House seats right there. And if theoretically, if they can hold their own everywhere else and gerrymander 7 or 8 new seats, they're going to have a majority. So, but I have the privilege of representing a mostly blue district. And so I put no money in my campaigns into TV, radio, consultants, pollsters, any of that stuff. I put it into 2 things. One is supporting candidates in swing districts across the country, and 2, into a project called Democracy Summer, which is now nationwide, which is mobilizing high school and college students to get involved in democratic politics, to learn about the history of social change, and then to learn how to register voters and how to organize people. And that's going to be the ticket for us. The hardcore that's left with Donald Trump is going to be working furiously and madly like religious cultists who sleep on the floor and listen to Donald Trump tapes all night and sell incense and flowers at the airport. Okay, they're going to be out there. But what we need is a massive upsurge of Democrats all over the country in every place fighting for democracy. And that's going to be our best hope of resisting the means of gerrymandering.
I would add too that if you look at Georgia and how Democrats won not just the electoral vote for Biden, but also those 2 Senate seats, it was Stacey Abrams and it was her political organizing. When you can no longer rely on the courts to protect voting rights, you've got to redouble your efforts. And of course that costs money, but it costs a lot of time too. You've got to make sure people are registered to vote. Now in Georgia, you're going to have to make sure that people who want to vote by mail are going to put ID numbers on their ballots, and they may not have the right ID to be able to put the number on the ballot. So that's going to take effort. And that's effort that, instead of getting out the vote, you're doing election protection. But so it might turnout could go up despite the strict voting rules, because actions create reactions, right? And the reaction is political organizing. And I think it's hand-to-hand combat, it's state-by-state battles over these rules. And as Texas is now about to consider its strict voting rules, American Airlines came out and said, you shouldn't suppress the vote. And now people say, we're not going to fly American Airlines. We're not going to drink Coca-Cola because they've come out in Georgia. But getting civic groups, getting corporations, getting the public excited about democracy and pushing back against these laws, that Georgia law would have been worse if the business community and the Chamber of Commerce didn't push against it. So there's got to be organizing in every state to fight these things, because the courts will not save us.
If somebody asks, specifically since you mentioned Mike Pence, what do you both think his future will be, given that he supported the constitutional process to ratify the Electoral College vote? Can he recover from that?
I'm going to leave that to Jamie.
Okay.
I mean, I have no idea. I have a few friends I could ask in the Republican Party, but if I had to guess, I would say he's gone. I mean, they'll find someone who will be the link to the religious right, other than him. But I think in that clutch moment, he stood by the Constitution. They wanted him to declare unilateral, unprecedented powers to refuse the electoral votes of Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, all to lower Biden's vote below 270 in the Electoral College so they could kick it into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election. And the reason for that, you might ask, why would they want Nancy Pelosi and a bunch of liberal Democrats deciding? It's because we don't vote one member, one vote in the House in a contingent election. We vote one state, one vote, and they controlled 27 states. Because of the fundamental disproportion that we're not going to be able to do anything about probably this century in terms of the states in the Senate and so on. One of the things, by the way, Jane, I learned when I was over in the Senate, which really stunned me, was 50 Democrats in the Senate, 50 Republicans. The 50 Democrats represent 45 million more people than the 50 Republicans do.
Unbelievable. These are the structural things that you were talking about that really need to be addressed. Well, a number of people have the same question. I think it's a question an awful lot of people in the country have, which is, so what do you think an ordinary citizen can do to counter the anti-democratic trends that are now so obvious throughout our system?
Well, what I would say to this is, my dad used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And so each one of you out there, you are the hope for democracy, to be teaching our kids, our grandkids, what democracy is about, what we are fighting for, and then working to defend democratic practices that are being besieged and democratic institutions that are being besieged, and then to continue the expansion of democracy. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that in America, voting rights and democracy are always either shrinking and being reduced, or they're expanding and they're growing. And we've got to get American democracy back on a growth path, which is one reason that I am a major supporter of statehood for people in Washington, D.C. and statehood for people in Puerto Rico. We can't let democracy shrivel away. We've got to keep expanding voting rights and deepening the meaning of democracy for the people.
And I would add that pressure on wavering Democrats is important right now. The fact that Democrats think there aren't enough Democrats to blow up the filibuster for promoting voting rights. Are judges more important than democracy and the right to vote? I mean, I wrote back in Slate in 2018 that we need to take this moment that may be gone in less than 2 years. Take this moment and play anti-hardball, right? Pass rules that make it harder for Republicans to use the structural advantages that they have to entrench minoritarian rule. We need rule by the majority, and that requires political action in every state and against those wavering Democrats who are not willing to do what it's going to take to assure that we can have a small d democratic future.
So we've got, it's funny, I was asked to end on an up note, and yet also mention that the next program is called America in Decline, next week's with Mike Mullen. But I do hear elements of fight and elements of optimism from you, and an interest in what kids may be doing. The younger generation seems to be, I would say very, very much engaged, and I think increasingly democratic from what I've been able to see. So I as a reporter, see a lot of hope out there, despite it all, I have to say. And I've got to say, I want to thank you both again so much for your time, for all the things that you do. You're both just incredible public servants, both of you. So thank you very much. And I'm going to ask our hosts for the evening if they want to say more about the upcoming program. I assume they're here and listening in. No? All right, well.
Yes, here I am. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much, Rick and Congressman and Jane, for tonight. And we hope that you'll all come back next week. It's a depressing title, but it should not be a depressing program. And decline can also have an incline afterwards. So that's what we're hoping for. That's what the Congressman and Rick have suggested, and Jane as well, that there are points of optimism, and we all have to be as informed as possible to be able to engage in that way and create the America that we want to sustain. So thank you all for being with us, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you, all of you, for participating in tonight's program.